Welcome back to our study on the book of Romans. This is the Romans Education Part 7, and this is session 42. We just got through reading Isaiah chapter 2, verses 10 to 22. And let's take a look at the things individually that we found in this. I think everybody will be on the same page here. In Isaiah chapter 2, in verse 11, the lofty looks of man shall be humbled. And if you thought that was part of what the Lord was judging there, you're right. And the haughtiness of men shall be bowed down, and the Lord alone shall be exalted in that day. That is an important thing to say at the end. By the way, did you notice, and you're going to see this all throughout, look at verse 11. The lofty looks of man shall be humbled, and the haughtiness of men. Did you notice that there was it used both forms of that, man and men. And that is because men are exalting themselves both individually and corporately. I mean, as a whole group. And that you're going to see that use of the phrase change. You're going to see that all through this passage. And then we'll skip down to verse 12. For the day of the Lord of hosts shall be upon everyone that is proud and lofty, and upon everyone that is lifted up, and he shall be brought low. And that, by the way, that and he shall be brought low, that is what the Lord is going to accomplish by means of His judgments against those people who think more highly of themselves than they ought to think. I'm using that terminology that we're used to out of Romans chapter 12. This goes beyond just the simple things of pride. And I'm going to try to explain that to you in just a moment. But I want to get to this next verse and show you this. In verse 11, I'm sorry, I should have had verse 13 up there. And again, let me just read it to you. And upon all the cedars of Lebanon that are high and lifted up, and upon all the oaks of Bashan. And in your note taker, you have this. You have two epithets that are given there. The cedars of Lebanon and the oaks of Bashan. The cedars of Lebanon are the reference to Israel's governmental rulers. And the oaks of Bashan is the reference to Israel's religious leaders who are promoting her, and this is where I'm going to be using this from time to time. We used it long ago. I'm just bringing it back. Propagating her vain religious system. That's what that VRS is. When you see that, I just don't want to type all that out every single time. The religious leaders are the ones that are promoting that vain religious system. And then on verse 14, and upon all the high mountains, and upon all the hills that are lifted up, and upon every high tower, and upon every fenced wall, upon all the ships of Tarshish, upon all pleasant pictures. And by the way, when you see all that, you look at that and you say, well, what is wrong with that? And what it's talking about here are the things in connection with the pride and the haughtiness and the lifted upness of what these people are doing. And I'm going to explain more about that. But verse 17 says, and the loftiness of man shall be bowed down, and the haughtiness of men, you see that double use there again in verse 17, shall be made low, and the Lord alone shall be exalted in that day. And that's exactly all of those things are fitting under a category. Which category are those fitting under? Pride of life. Thank you. Now, what I want to do is, for what you're going to add, and if you have your deal from last week, this is what we're going to start adding here. I want to take all of these for now, and I want to combine them into a single phrase. Later, we'll have reason to come back and just look at a couple of them and see them individually for what they are. But there's something about what men are doing. Now, look, let me just say it this way, and I think we'll understand more about it as we go through. This is the pride that men have as they look at the world around them and what they're doing in that world, and they see themselves becoming, that they see themselves as becoming more and more sophisticated and better and advancing more and more. And they're looking at this now from a point of view that it says, when the Lord says, I'm going to do this so the Lord alone will be exalted in that day, they're exalting everything else but the Lord. They're exalting, it's not just that they think highly of some things, they're exalting all of these things above the Lord. And so here's the thing that I want you to put, I don't think I have it on the PowerPoint, but let me just look. Verse 22, did I just skip that? I did, but let me just say, by the way, I said this was rhetorical. Cease ye from man whose breath is in his nostrils, for wherein is he to be accounted? Here's all these guys that are thinking so highly of themselves. I'm all this. I'm so great. I'm so powerful. And they've got all this superlative about themselves. And God says, you do realize the only reason you're here is because you have breath in your nostrils.
They're all concentrating on material things instead of spiritual.
They're concentrating on the material things. They're looking at very inwardly in themselves, and God says, you're not what you think you are, and I'm going to judge this, and I'm going to show you.
Nobody shares His glory.
No one shares His glory. And we've seen that issue mentioned all through this passage. So now, this is man's self-estimation. This is how much he thinks he's worth. This is the evolution of him becoming better and better. So I think I have it on the PowerPoint. Here it is. What I'd like for you to write in under the pride of life now, and the next thing is prideful thinking. Prideful thinking. Now I know that's not a big advancement when you look at it in the category of the pride of life. But all I'm trying to do here, and I'm going to do this in all of these categories, is I'm going to start encapsulating them into a single phrase, and then we're just going to start referring to it that way. Now we are going to be able to look at some particular things that make up that prideful thinking. But there's more than one, but that's why there's different terms being used. For instance, that word haughtiness, we are going to come back and we're going to take a look. That's one of the two terms we're going to look at. We're going to take a look at this term of haughtiness that the Lord is going to point out here, because that expression of haughtiness is describing a particular kind of prideful thinking. It is a particular kind of prideful thinking that goes right along with what Satan is wanting to produce in the world. It isn't just a guy doing a good job and being really pleased with the job he did. This is something that's taking it way beyond that, to the exclusion of God. Okay, and so, and there's another term we're going to look at, lofty looks. And just to kind of set your thinking about that, that's not, we tend to think of that like, well, that person, if you think lofty looks, they just got that look of being superior on their face. But this is more, this phrase is more than just how we're treating others. This actually has to do with a prideful thinking about our future and our destiny. This is what's happening in the minds of men, where they think they're going to wind up. God's going to say, you're not going to wind up there at all. You think because you overestimate yourself.
Arrogance going into demigod?
Oh, that's a really good term. Arrogance. It is. It's an absolute arrogance. And you know, you're saying to be demigods. They're going to take God's glory for themselves. They absolutely are. This is the shocking end of what's taking place out here in the remaining portion of Satan's night. And so this pride of life. So what I need us to do is to see this pride of life, this prideful thinking. It was that prideful thinking that took place in the garden that caused man to fall. It was that prideful thinking that produced the world of the ungodly, that the flood perished. The flood destroyed. It's that same prideful thinking that was moving. These are works of darkness. Not every prideful thought is a work of darkness, but these are a particular kind of prideful thoughts that are actually moving man to produce again the world of the ungodly. God interrupted all of that with this dispensation of grace, but He's going to take that prideful thinking and develop it again out here in the remaining portion of His night to produce the absolute apex of darkness with regard to the pride of life. And that's exactly, by the way, what Satan is producing today in his works of darkness in that category. A particular kind of prideful thinking. And so what Satan is doing is, in an effort to hang on to his possession of the earth, and in an effort to get men to work right alongside of him to produce what he's after here, he needs men to develop, even now in this dispensation of grace, to develop some particular ways of thinking pridefully, because they're going to lead him to the next step. And that's what he's after there. And as we have already talked about, that prideful thinking is going to wind up in its worst form out here, where men are first of all going to look at the man, the Antichrist, and they're going to ascribe deity to him, that which belongs only to God. And then he is going to renew the covenant. Not wrong. He's going to renew an agreement that was made back in the garden with men during that day, that ye shall be as gods. And that's exactly where this prideful thinking is leading to, that men will believe they're gods. And that's why, by the way, if I can just recall it without going back to those verses, that's why Isaiah said over and over again, and the Lord alone shall be exalted in that day. Because men are going to, first they're going to do the next step, we're going to exalt a man. That's Satan's guy coming on the scene, the Antichrist. And then we're going to exalt ourselves. We're going to be gods among gods. And God's going to say, now I'm going to judge that. And I hate these works of darkness here because these particular works of darkness are producing a prideful thinking that leads men to that end. And that's what he's after to destroy. And their haughtiness is going to increase, and their lofty looks is going to increase. And that's why, and when Jesus foretold that, and John records it here, I forgot about this. I was going to show you this verse. I just skipped over it. When we talked about the glory of His majesty, we kept seeing that, and Karen mentioned a moment ago, He's not going to share His glory with anyone. Remember, this is the problem they had before. Because that when they knew God, they glorified Him not as God. They refused to give God the glory that was due Him for who He was, for being deity. But they will give it to the Antichrist, which is John 5:44. Jesus said, I come in my Father's name, and you receive me not. If another shall come in his own name, him ye will receive. And indeed that is true. Now you've got a little thing on your note taker there, and it looks like a series of arrows that do like this, and there's a box up above. And so here's what I'd like for us to do. On this side, you've got a line there to put something. This is godliness on this end. And what Satan is doing is he is not just working to produce ungodliness, he is actually working at the end of this to produce Sataniness. In other words, he wants men not just to be in rebellion against God, but to be in league with Him. And that box up above, one of the prime drivers to move men to becoming like Satan is man's, this goes in that box, increasing pride. That is the tool that Satan is using to produce a world that goes a step further than just the repudiation of God, but the total embracement of the adversary. And so God is going to judge all that in that day. Now what we need to do is we need to move now to the destruction of the second and third categories. So let me show you this next one, and we'll do it. Now that was Isaiah chapter 2. Now we're going to be in Isaiah chapter 3. So we'll start reading here in verse 9. The show of their countenance doth witness against them, and they declare their sin as Sodom. They hide it not. Now that is a very interesting phrase. They declare their sin as Sodom. They hide it not. That's one of the ways that you know when I make that statement, they're not just going to do this and act humble about it. They're going to revel in it. They're going to exult in it. He says they're going to be like Sodom. They're going to wear it like a badge of honor. They're not going to be ashamed of it. They're going to try to make you ashamed. And by the way, there's a lot of precursors to that you see go on in the world. It says, woe unto their soul, for they have rewarded evil unto themselves. Say ye to the righteous, that it shall be well with him, for they shall eat the fruit of their doings. Woe unto the wicked, it shall be ill with him, for the reward of his hands shall be given him. As for my people, children are their oppressors, and women rule over them. O my people, they which lead thee cause thee to err, and destroy the way of thy paths. The Lord, now look at this. Remember, He arose to judge. He ariseth. Remember we saw in chapter 2? Look in chapter 3 now. The Lord standeth up to plead, and standeth to judge the people. Why is He stand? Because He was seated. That's the way He's going to be until you get out here, and then He's going to stand up. That's what was so significant about Stephen here saying, I see the Son of Man standing at the right hand of the Father. Because all those Old Testament passages talked about when He rises up or when He stands up, it's going to be to judge them. That's how you knew that was coming. You want to know how much? Here's how little people know about the Bible. And I'm not trying to just make fun of that, but because they don't know about those passages, when they see Stephen say, I see the Son of Man standing at the right hand of the Father, this is the sermons that came out of that. Stephen was so faithful, the Lord was standing up to welcome him to heaven. That's a complete lack of understanding of what has been sitting back here in the prophets. Those things that are happening out here, we should be able to see everything that's happening out here and come right back to the prophets and locate that.
Could you repeat
that about Stephen?
No.
About we should be able to go back and locate that. Sure, all the things that we see happening out here in the day of the Lord, and the judgments and all the, or even Stephen talking about the Lord stand. Anything you see that, you should be able to go back to the prophets and locate those things back there in the prophets. Those things aren't happening, and you don't have any reference for it. All of that's sitting back there. Remember when I talked about in Revelation, it says they will hide themselves in the rocks and the dens of the mountains and all of that. We've seen that twice here in Isaiah already. See, all of that, you're able to go back to the... That's why I'm telling you, if you're going to really know your Father's business, you can't just look at something out there and go, oh, that's just happening there. You're supposed to look at that and go, hey, I knew that was happening. This is part of what the prophets talked about. That's why I gave you those 7 things, because you can say, look, in this particular area, like when he talks about the Lord's Day, I know he's going to be talking about those things. So,
Be proud of it.
huh?
And not be proud
And
of it.
yeah, they're gonna exalt in their haughtiness and their lofty looks and their pride and their arrogance. I love that word. That's exactly how they are. And they're arrogant, and they're going to deny God the glory that is due Him, and they're not going to do it accidentally. They're going to do it on purpose. See, that's that wicked concept. These are willing participants in Satan's policies of evil. These guys have made a choice of whose side they're on. And so God says, I'm punishing this. This is the thing that I abhor. Okay, so as we read through here, he says, verse 13, the Lord standeth up to plead and standeth to judge the people. The Lord will enter into judgment with the ancients of His people and the princes thereof. For ye have eaten up the vineyard. The spoil of the poor is in your houses. What mean ye that ye beat my people to pieces and grind the faces of the poor, saith the Lord God of hosts. So He's setting you up again, because what is He doing here? He's talking to us about what they're doing that's going to deserve the judgment. Remember here, He set us up from verses 6 to 9, and then in verse 10 to 22, He says, this is what I'm judging. Well, we're being set up again here. Well, in one of these two categories, we're being set up again. And when He says, this is why you deserve this. This is why it's coming. And then what we'll do is we'll turn the page of that, and we'll see what God is going to do to judge all of that. Okay, so take a look with me now. Now that's verse 15. Now we're going to turn to the judgment of it. Now this one, I'm not going to ask you to identify it. And I'm going to tell you why. Because I misidentified this the first time I read it. And besides, the clock is ticking on us. So here's what I want to do. I want to identify it for you because this one is a little bit tricky. By the way, if you misidentified it, I think later you'd see something that would make you go, oh, you know what? This actually belongs over here. I think we would correct ourselves. But because we're just getting started, I don't want to get real picky about that, but let me just show this to you. Verse 16. Moreover, the Lord saith, because the daughters of Zion are haughty. So you know what He's going to do now? He's going to... Wasn't haughtiness one of the elements of that prideful thinking? Now what He's going to do is take that prideful thinking and add some things to it. It's not that... And by the way, just because He's talking to Israel here, does that mean the world wasn't haughty? Are you kidding? They were just as bad as Israel. And when He talks about this next category, He is showing you, He doesn't mean to say they're not guilty of this. They're going to be guilty of this, but they're going to be guilty of the others too. But now He's going to use a different example to bring off one of these other categories. He says, because the daughters of Zion are haughty, and walk with stretched forth necks and wanton eyes, walking and mincing as they go, and making a tinkling with their feet. Now before we keep reading, let me just call your attention to something in this passage here. When he talks about the daughters of Zion, Isaiah is writing about a group of women that everyone can look at with their eyes at the time he's writing back here and know exactly who he's talking about. And the reason he's using them is because he's giving them an illustration and saying, they're the epitome of what I'm about to talk about. If you know what that is, then you know exactly what I'm describing. And so he's going to move on here and talk about these daughters of Zion. He says, verse 17, therefore the Lord will smite with a scab the crown of the head of the daughters of Zion, and the Lord will discover their secret parts. And the reason he's talking about that is because those secret parts are the things that they desire to utilize the most, or the things they do desire, they do utilize the most to entice men. This is sexual in nature, and he's describing it just that way. And so as we move through these verses, and the Lord says He's going to... Now you can read the rest of this chapter on your own. What I need us to do is get to a word that I'm going to put in up here that will describe what's going on in this chapter. Because as you read on down, he's going to talk about the attire of these women. He's going to talk about the reason that they are dressing themselves and revealing themselves is for the purpose of doing something in accordance with Satan's works of darkness. And I'm going to leave that right there, and I'm going to write this. Well, I got to give you the deal. So let me just give you the next thing. It's under lust of the eyes, and I first put it under lust of the flesh. And do you know why? Because chapter 5 is actually going to give us lust of the flesh. I'm not saying that tells you what chapter 3 is, but I'm going to back you up to the verse to show you this. And I'm going to put it under this term, wantonness. Yes, because in that, Karen picked up on it, in that verse, I'm just going to back up and show it to you real quick. Look what it says up here. Moreover, the Lord said, because the daughters of Zion are haughty and walk with stretched forth necks and wanton eyes. That was the key I missed when I read through that the first time. It is pleasant to the eyes. There is something now being ornamented and displayed and all of that is meant to be very appealing to the eye, to create something here. And wantonness, I'll go ahead and just write it in on mine because we're going to be adding to this as we go through. But that wantonness is something, and by the way, did this strike when you saw that? Maybe it didn't, but with me, because I'm looking at all of this as I'm preparing. Do you remember in Romans chapter 14, he gives you 3 pairs of terms over there when he talks about the godly labor. And he says, let us walk honestly as in the day, not in rioting and drunkenness, not in chambering and wantonness, not in strife and envying. You know what he did? He took that very word that was in Isaiah and he made that one of the pairs that he's warning us about. And by the way, those pairs, I just want to say a sentence to remind you. He is not saying to the Romans, you guys are doing this stuff, quit doing it. He is saying to the Romans that when you cast off the works of darkness, it is these 3 pairs that are going to be used against you to get you to back off from your casting off the works of darkness and get you to kind of cool it with regard to your stand against Satan, to get you to compromise that stand. What he's really after is to shut that down altogether. And so he's going to bring out of those, and you'll see when we get over there, out of those things, he's going to bring pressure to bear on you to get you to back off. So you're being warned about that right up front. But I'm just pointing this out because when he talks about this, by the way, we're going to add these later, but you could mentally, you could do it right now. You could even write it in right now. When you look at these 3 pairs, you ought to be able to look at those 3 pairs and be able to know exactly where they're going to go on those categories. Because that's why there's 3 pairs. Because they match the 3 categories. Just as we're going to begin to see those things as we go through the rest of Isaiah. Okay, so we're not going to have time to get the rest of this in here. But what we are going to do is we're going to come back and we're going to take right up with chapter 5. And what you can do is you can go over and read chapter 5. By the way, you already know there's only one left. You know where chapter 5 has got to go. But what I want to do is I want to bring chapter 5 down so we can pull it all down into a single word again. And the reason I want to pull this down into a single word or a single phrase is because as Paul begins to talk about these things, we're going to have to see the words that he's using, not just back in Isaiah. Yes, wantonize and mincing and all that stuff. Paul is going to talk about this. He's going to talk about lasciviousness. And he's going to talk about, oh gee, that word went right out of my head. It's a big one. You know the one. Concupiscence, thank you. Yeah, concupiscence and lasciviousness. These are words that we're going to have to look at because Paul's not just mentioning them out there for no reason. He's saying, look, these are the kinds of things that I'm talking about when I'm talking about this. These are These are particular works of darkness that produce a wantonness that is going to take people to a zenith of ungodliness, just like there was a zenith out here in the pride of life. There's a zenith here in the lust of the eyes. There's a zenith here in the lust of the flesh. Because what he's looking at here is that these things that produce a wantonness are going to make every deviant lifestyle acceptable, so that there will be absolutely nothing that people will engage in that will be considered to be perverse. Nothing will be perverse anymore. It will all be acceptable. And if you look around in this country, those works of darkness are producing that mindset in people today. That there is the line of what's improper gets pushed further and further and further away. The goal for Satan out here in the remaining portion of his night is for people to be able to do anything that occurs to them, and it is all going to be acceptable. I'm going to tell you the next step in that. It will not only be acceptable to them, but if you oppose it, you will come under attack. And that is when they will begin to call evil good and good evil. Well, and as many of you are nodding your heads, and I hear you, this is already happening, then you know what you're at. No, okay, just take that right there and think with me. Because now, when I see what's happening in the world, yes, men are doing this. Yes, men are doing this. But look, there is someone behind it all who has an agenda and an end to that agenda, and he is using the psychology that he understands against men to get them to buy into this and to participate and to get on board with it, because he's taking all of this and he's going somewhere with it and he's promoting it. And that's why, look, you understand, this cuts to the very moral fiber of individuals in this country. And we all ought to come to the realization that no matter who sits in the White House, you can't change the individual moral fiber of this country through legislation. People are going to do what they're going to do because they have bought into the darkness.
They're doing it though. Look at your same-sex.
Well, okay, I'm not saying we're not legislating that way, but I'm saying even if you did, even if you tried to legislate righteousness, you can't legislate what somebody does in their own home behind doors that no one sees. You can't do that. And that's why when you look at this world, look, I'm just going to say it this way. And I don't want this pulpit to become a political bully pulpit. I think there are better people and worse people for the country. But I also realize this, and this is the more important issue, that Satan's works of darkness are going to continue right along. I don't care if you put me in the White House. And I couldn't do that job, wouldn't want the job. First, I don't want a demotion. But secondly, because I feel like what I'm doing is more important. I believe it's important, but I don't believe it's the end all. And so, and I don't say that haughtily, I say that truthfully. I believe this work is more important. But, and you know what? Here's another thing. I don't desire to age 30 years in the next 4 years. I think that job grinds everybody to powder. But my point is this: no matter who you put in there, I only use myself to say, even if you put someone in there who knew that, there's only one thing that's going to affect those works of darkness, and that is sons and daughters who know how to cast them off. That's the only thing that's going to do it. So what he's doing in this world is going to continue right along. What we're going to see is we're going to see the effects of that dragging right along behind that, in which, like you, and I know everybody in this room can see this, the things that we're talking about, you're saying to yourself, I already see these things happening. I'm just saying this. When I see that, I'm pointing my finger at the adversary and saying, this is how successful he's being with his works of darkness. This is where he's going with this. This is what he's trying to do. So we have one more general term to fill in over here, which we are going to do the very first thing in our next session. And then what we're going to do is I'm going to take you to a different place, and we're going to start to fill in now individual things underneath here that you need to see, because these are the things you'll be casting off. This is where we really begin to identify them for what they are. So you're not just spending your time on something that isn't really a work of darkness, but you're able to identify the work of darkness and see what Satan is doing with it and have an understanding of it. Okay, so we'll do that. We'll start in Isaiah chapter 5, and we'll have a closing word of prayer, and then I have stuff to hand out to you. So let's have prayer. Father, thank you for your word and what it says to us. We're grateful, Lord, for the opportunity to engage in you with this operation, and we pray to do so with the enthusiasm that shows us to be sons that are glad to be able to stand against the adversary and his policies of evil.